3:15 in the morning, Naval Air Station Keflavik. The AN/SPY-6 radar operators were the first to see the ghosts on their glass. The returns were faint, notched deep into the electronic clutter of the North Atlantic chop, but they were moving steadily at 500 kilometers per hour. Something was crossing the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap that did not have a registered flight plan and was refusing to respond to automated interrogation pings. This was no longer a routine monitoring mission of the northern latitudes. This was the beginning of a coordinated breach of sovereign airspace. The Icelandic wind screamed against the hardened radar domes, carrying the sharp scent of salt and frozen iron across the basalt landscape. Inside the darkened command center, the air was still and smelled of stale coffee and the ozone of high-output electronics. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, the lead controller confirmed the signatures. These were not civilian charters or atmospheric anomalies. The radar cross-sections matched the profiles of the Tu-95 Bear bomber, a massive, four-engine turboprop relic of the Cold War that had been upgraded with modern avionics and long-range strike capabilities. There were 8 of them, flying in 2 separate cells of 4, staggered at altitudes of 8,000 and 9,000 meters. They were operating out of the Olenja Air Base on the Kola Peninsula, and they were now less than 400 kilometers from the coast of Iceland. The base commander at Keflavik did not hesitate. The order was given to scramble the F-35 Lightning fighters of the 480th Fighter Squadron. Within 90 seconds, the sound of jet engines tore through the silence of the Arctic night. The twin-engine roar of the fighters drowned out the wind as 4 aircraft taxied rapidly toward the runway. Each pilot was strapped into a cockpit that felt more like a spaceship than a traditional aircraft, their helmets projecting a 360-degree view of the battle space directly onto their visors. As the fighters climbed into the thin, freezing air, the tactical situation shifted from observation to imminent engagement. At 3:22 in the morning, the Tu-95 Bear bombers reached their designated launch points. They did not need to enter the teeth of the Icelandic air defenses to deliver their payload. The bombers began their launch sequence, internal rotary launchers spinning, to bring their primary weapons into position. One by one, the KH-101 cruise missiles were released from the bellies of the bombers. The missiles fell for a few seconds in a dead drop before their small turbofan engines ignited, kicking out a bright blue-white flame that was visible even on the long-range infrared cameras at the base. These missiles were stealthy, designed to fly just dozens of meters above the wave tops to hide from radar, and they were now programmed with the exact coordinates of the Keflavik fuel farms, the main runway, and the command and control bunkers. By 3:25 in the morning, 48 cruise missiles were in the air, screaming across the North Atlantic at 800 kilometers per hour. The United States Air Force pilots in the F-35 Lightning fighters pushed their throttles into afterburner, the sudden surge of power pinning them into their seats as they raced to intercept the subsonic threats. The sky was no longer empty. It was filled with dozens of independent actors, each one a potential bringer of catastrophic damage to the most strategic outpost in the Atlantic. The mission was clear, but the scale was overwhelming. The radar at Keflavik showed a swarm of red icons closing in from the north. The pilots had to prioritize. They had to choose which missiles to kill and which ones to leave for the ground-based defenses. The heat of the jet exhaust shimmered in the dark, a stark contrast to the -40-degree temperature outside the cockpit glass. The first missiles would reach the coastline in less than 12 minutes. If the defense failed here, the United States Navy would lose its primary eyes and ears in the North Atlantic, leaving the sea lanes open to a subsurface threat that had been waiting for this exact moment. 3:26 in the morning, 4 F-35 Alpha Lightning fighters of the 480th Fighter Squadron tore through the low-hanging Arctic clouds at twice the speed of sound. The pilots were pushed deep into their carbon fiber seats as the afterburners of their single engines dumped massive amounts of raw energy into the freezing night air, creating 2-meter-long diamonds of white-hot flame behind each aircraft. The cockpit of the lead fighter, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller, was a silent, high-technology sanctuary. There were no traditional dials or gauges. Instead, the entire front of the cockpit was a single, seamless touchscreen display, and her helmet-mounted display projected the entire battlefield directly onto her retina. The AN/APG-81 AESA radar in the nose of her jet was already scanning the horizon, looking for the tiny radar cross-sections of the incoming KH-101 cruise missiles. Below the fighters, the North Atlantic was a churning cauldron of black water and white foam. The air smelled of ozone and the sharp chemical bite of burned JP-8 jet fuel that lingered. In the wake of the scramble, lead to flight, Miller's voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the roar of the engines. I have 24 positive tracks at range 60 kilometers. They are running low, staying in the wave shadows, transitioning to master arm hot. Engage according to the distributed fire plan. On the ground at Naval Air Station Keflavik, the situation was a controlled explosion of activity. The 3rd Battalion of the 7th Air Defense Artillery Regiment had brought their National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System units to full combat readiness. The launchers, hidden in hardened revetments along the perimeter of the airfield, swiveled toward the north. These systems were loaded with AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range, air-to-air missiles, adapted for ground launch. The ground crews, wearing heavy winter parkas and night vision goggles, scrambled across the tarmac. They were not just launching fighters, they were preparing for the impact. The base's siren wailed in the distance, a long, mournful cry that signaled the red air condition. In the command bunker, the floor shuddered as the first of the ground-based interceptors launched. A National Advanced Surface-to-Air missile roared off its rails, the solid-fuel rocket motor illuminating the entire northern end of the runway in a brilliant orange flash. The missile accelerated instantly to Mach 3, its nose cone glowing as it began its high-speed climb before diving back down toward the wave tops. The F-35 Alpha pilots began their own engagement. From the internal weapons bays of the stealth fighters, AIM-120 Delta missiles were dropped into the slipstream. For a fraction of a second, the missiles fell away from the jets, then their motors ignited with a sharp, violent crack. The sky was suddenly crisscrossed with white smoke trails, each one a precision-guided interceptor seeking out a Russian cruise missile. Fox 3. Miller called out as her first 2 missiles left the bay. Impact in 12 seconds. The engagement was happening at ranges where the human eye was useless. It was a war of data links and radar pulses. The AN/SPY-6 radar on the ground was feeding mid-course corrections to the missiles in flight, ensuring that even as the KH-101 missiles attempted to maneuver, the American interceptors stayed locked. On 16 miles offshore, the destroyer DDG-131, the USS John Basilone, was also contributing to the shield. The ship's Aegis combat system had integrated with the base defenses through a secure Link 16 data network. The destroyer's Mark 41 vertical launch system erupted, sending evolved Sea Sparrow missiles into the air to provide a final layer of protection for the base's northern approach. The night was no longer dark. It was a grid of light and fire, where the technology of the United States military was being tested against. A saturation strike of unprecedented scale. The first of the interceptors reached their targets. High above the water, small flashes of white light began to dot the horizon, the sound of the explosions muffled by the distance and the wind, but the results clearly visible on the radar screens in the bunker. Splash 1, Splash 2, Miller reported. Multiple hits, but they are still coming. We have leakers. I repeat, we have leakers moving toward the fuel farm. The first wave of defense had been effective, but 48 missiles were too many for a single intercept layer to catch. 12 missiles had survived the initial gauntlet and were now less than 2 minutes from the hangars of Keflavik. 3:32 in the morning. The northern approach to Naval Air Station Keflavik. The destroyer DDG-131, the USS John Basilone, surged through 4-meter swells, its hull buried in white foam as the Aegis combat system transitioned to terminal defense mode. 12 KH-101 cruise missiles were now less than 15 kilometers from the primary fuel farm, flying at an altitude of just 30 meters to mask their approach against the clutter of the waves. The air above the deck was a freezing mist of salt spray and transition smoke, smelling of ozone and the sharp chemical bite of high-explosive steady-state electronics. Vampire, vampire, vampire. The tactical air officer shouted inside the ship's combat information center. The blue-lit room was a hive of controlled intensity, where sailors monitored glowing consoles that tracked the incoming threats in real time. The ship's close-in weapon system, the 20mm phalanx rotary cannon, began its automated search pattern. The radar dish on top of the gun mount twitched with robotic precision, slaving the barrels to the lead contact. At a range of 2,000 meters, the gun opened fire. The sound was not a series of individual shots, but a continuous, vibrating roar, 100 rounds per second of tungsten cord ammunition tearing through the night air. A stream of white-hot tracers reached out from the USS John Basilone, walking across the dark horizon until they intersected with the lead cruise missile. The KH-101 erupted in a violent flash of orange, its airframe shredded by the weight of the fire. Debris skipped across the surface of the water like stones before sinking into the abyss. On the shoreline, the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System batteries launched their final interceptors. 4 more missiles were knocked out of the sky 3 kilometers from the runway, their warheads detonating with enough force to shatter the windows of the nearby air traffic control tower. The sky was a chaotic tapestry of smoke trails and brief, blinding flashes of light. Despite the density of the fire, 7 missiles remained. They were no longer flying in a straight line. Their onboard computers were executing pre-programmed terminal maneuvers, weaving and dipping to avoid the defensive fire. They crossed the rocky coastline at 64 degrees north, 22 degrees west, their turbofan engines screaming as they accelerated for the final strike. The F-35 Alpha pilots, having exhausted their internal missile bays, banked hard to the south, their sensors tracking the remaining threats they could no longer engage. Lieutenant Colonel Miller watched the thermal feed on her display as the 7 missiles split into 2 groups. 3 were headed for the massive white tanks of the fuel farm, which held over 10 million liters of high-grade jet fuel. The other 4 were tracking toward the hardened aircraft shelters, where the rest of the squadron was being fueled and armed. "Defense is bypassed," Miller radioed, her voice tight with the realization of what was coming. "Impact in 15 seconds. All ground personnel, take cover. I repeat, take cover." At the base, the close-in weapon systems mounted on heavy trucks near the fuel farm opened fire, their barrels glowing cherry red in the darkness. The smell of burning gunpowder and scorched metal filled the air as the defensive screen reached its absolute limit. 2 more missiles were clipped, one spinning wildly into the basalt rocks of the perimeter fence, but the remaining 5 were locked on. The shield had held for as long as it could. The battle was moving from the air to the ground. 3:33 in the morning. Naval Air Station Keflavik. The 5 surviving KH-101 cruise missiles completed their terminal maneuvers, their internal guidance systems slaved to the high-contrast infrared signatures of the base's primary infrastructure. The night sky over the Reykjanes Peninsula, usually a void of deep purple and black, was suddenly ripped open by 5 distinct points of blinding white light as the missile's turbofans went to maximum thrust for the final 3 seconds of flight. The first 3 missiles impacted the northern fuel farm at coordinates 63 degrees 58 minutes north, 22 degrees 36 minutes west. The 450-kilogram high-explosive warheads did not just detonate, they punched through the double-walled steel of the storage tanks before the fuses triggered. The result was a catastrophic release of thermal energy. 3 million liters of JP-8 jet fuel were vaporized instantly, creating a mushroom cloud of orange fire that rose 400 meters into the freezing Arctic air. The shockwave rolled across the airfield, shattering the reinforced glass in the administrative buildings, and knocking sailors off their feet in the barracks 2 kilometers away. The air, which had been biting cold just seconds before, was suddenly blasted with a wave of dry, searing heat that smelled of burnt chemicals and scorched earth. The remaining 2 missiles struck the maintenance and logistics hub near the primary taxiway. One missile overshot its primary target and slammed into a hardened aircraft shelter. The reinforced concrete, 2 meters thick and designed to withstand near misses, groaned under the kinetic energy. The explosion was contained within the structure, but the blast pressure turned the interior of the hangar into a furnace, destroying 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters and the specialized diagnostic equipment used by the 748th Aircraft Maintenance Squadron. The 5th and final missile struck the secondary power substation. The impact was precise, severing the main electrical feeds to the northern half of the base. In an instant, the airfield lighting, the peripheral security sensors, and the non-essential communication arrays went dark. Only the hardened command centers and the radar arrays remained active, their transition to backup diesel generators seamless, but marked by a momentary flicker of the tactical displays. All stations, this is base command. The voice of the Emergency Operations Center director cut through the radio static. We have multiple hits. Fuel farm is a total loss. Fire teams, initiate foam suppression on the adjacent tanks. Medics to Hangar 3. This is not a drill. Despite the carnage, the professional discipline of the United States Air Force and Navy personnel took over immediately. The 72nd Air Base Wing Damage Control teams, wearing silver heat-reflective suits, were moving toward the inferno at the fuel farm within 90 seconds of the impact. The heavy crash fire rescue trucks, their engines roaring, began pumping thousands of liters of aqueous film-forming foam onto the remaining storage tanks to prevent a chain reaction. The smell of the base had changed. The crisp, clean scent of the North Atlantic had been replaced by a thick, oily smog that clung to the back of the throat. Black soot began to fall like snow across the runway, settling on the wings of the F-35 Lightning fighters that were being prepped for the next sortie. In the command bunker, the base commander stared at the status board. The damage was severe, but the runway was still operational. The Russian strike had intended to decapitate the base's ability to launch and recover aircraft, but the Mark 41 vertical launch system on the USS John Basilone was already reloading, and the AN/SPY-6 radar was still tracking the Tu-95 Bear bombers as they turned back toward the east. However, the radar screens were not clearing. As the bombers retreated, a new set of contacts appeared, faster, smaller, and flying in a tight, aggressive formation. The long-range aviation strike had been the opening move. Now, the Russian escort fighters, Su-57 Felons, were moving in to engage the American fighters that had intercepted the cruise missiles. The breach was over, but the duel for the sky above Iceland was just beginning. 3:38 in the morning, high altitude over the North Atlantic, 50 kilometers northeast of Naval Air Station Keflavik, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller pulled her F-35 Alpha Lightning into a steep, high-G climb, the engine's F-135 turbofan roaring as it pushed her toward 13,000 meters. Below her, the Icelandic coastline was a jagged black line, illuminated by the orange secondary explosions at the fuel farm. Above her, the sky was a deep, starless void, where the digital ghosts of the Su-57 Felon fighters were now operating. The air inside her cockpit was pressurized and smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic scent of the electronics cooling system. The tactical situation was a high-speed chess match played at Mach 1.6. The 4 American fighters were outnumbered, facing a flight of 6 Russian 5th-generation interceptors that were attempting to shield the retreating Tu-95 Bear bombers. Miller's sensor fusion display merged data from her own nose radar, the USS John Basilone, and the surviving ground-based sensors to create a god-eye view of the engagement. Flight. This is lead, Miller said, her breath sounding heavy through the mask as the G-forces pressed her into the seat. We have a split formation. 2 Felons. At high altitude, 4 more sweeping low. We are taking the high pair. Commit now. Miller selected the lead Russian fighter on her glass. With a thumb press on the side stick controller, she authorized the engagement. The internal weapons bay doors on the belly of her F-35 Alpha cycled open for less than a second, maintaining her stealth profile as the first weapon was released. The trigger was squeezed. The AIM-120 Delta missile shrieked off its internal launcher, a white column of fire punching backward through the freezing thin air at 40,000 feet. The heat blast from the rocket motor flashed against Miller's cockpit glass, momentarily bleaching the darkness of the sky. The missile accelerated instantly, to 4 times the speed of sound, its own active radar seeker waking up to hunt the target 24 kilometers away. 7 seconds later, the warhead reached its destination. The AIM-120 Delta punched through the composite skin of the Su-57 Felon's right engine intake before the proximity fuse triggered. The detonation was a focused cone of shrapnel that shredded the aircraft's titanium spine and ignited the internal fuel cells. The Russian fighter did not just stall. It erupted in a violent, jagged fireball that expanded 300 meters across the dark sky. 6 tons of advanced aerospace alloy were reduced to molten fragments and burning carbon fiber in a single heartbeat. The wreckage tumbling toward the freezing ocean in a long, spiraling arc of flame. The second Russian pilot reacted instantly, wrenching his aircraft into a desperate, high-alpha turn whilst dumping a curtain of magnesium flares that burned like miniature suns in the night. He did not wait for a lock. He fired a long-range R-37 Mike missile back toward Miller's last known position. Missile launch. Brake left. Brake left. The automated voice of the threat warning system screamed in Miller's ears. Miller kicked the rudder and slammed the stick to the left, the F-35 Alpha rolling 90 degrees as she dove toward the cloud deck. The incoming Russian missile, moving at 5 times the speed of sound, streaked past her cockpit, so close the shockwave caused her entire aircraft to shudder violently, the metal skin groaning under the pressure. She deployed a sequence of smart decoys, the electronic signatures confusing the Russian missile seeker until it lost track, and detonated harmlessly 5 kilometers behind her, the blast wave throwing a wall of white light across her rearview cameras. Black smoke and silver debris from the first destroyed Su-57 were still settling through the atmosphere when Miller's wingman, Captain David Viking Vance, confirmed a second kill on the low-altitude flight. The Russian formation, having lost its lead aircraft and failing to secure a kill on the American interceptors, began to fragment. The radio channels, which had been filled with the calm, rhythmic calls of the American pilots, were suddenly punctuated by the frantic, overlapping transmissions of the Russian flight leads as they realized their stealth advantage had been neutralized by the superior networking of the United States Air Force. The sky was a graveyard of falling fire. 2 Russian fighters were gone, and a third was limping east with a damaged wing root. The immediate threat to the base had been blunted, but the cost was etched into the horizon. Miller leveled her wings at 8,000 meters, looking down at the burning remains of the Keflavik fuel farm. The mission had shifted from interception to survival, and though they had won the first duel, the air above the North Atlantic remained a cold, contested theater of war. 3:55 in the morning. Naval Air Station Keflavik. The orange glow from the burning fuel farm cast long, flickering shadows across the primary runway, where the air was a thick, suffocating soup of black smoke and vaporized fire suppression foam. The temperature on the tarmac had plummeted back toward freezing, as the initial heat from the explosions dissipated, but the smell remained a heavy, oily stench of burnt JP-8 jet fuel, melted rubber, and the metallic tang of pulverized concrete. All personnel not assigned to damage control clear the flight line. The base giant voice system boomed, its electronic tone echoing off the jagged volcanic cliffs surrounding the station. Medical triage is established at Hangar 5. Watch for foreign object debris on Taxiway Alpha. The 72nd Air Base Wing Damage Control teams moved with a mechanical, practiced precision that defied the chaos of the night. 8 Oshkosh Striker fire trucks, massive 6-wheeled behemoths painted in high-visibility lime yellow, were positioned in a defensive semicircle around the remaining fuel tanks. Their roof-mounted turrets barked, sending high-pressure streams of aqueous film-forming foam into the heart of the inferno. The foam looked like dirty snow under the emergency lights, blanketing the burning fuel and cutting off the oxygen that fed the 300-meter-high flames. Near the edge of the maintenance apron, the 81st Medical Group had transformed the lobby of a hardened aircraft shelter into a casualty collection point. The air inside was bright and smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Medics in tactical vests worked under portable LED towers, their hands moving quickly over the wounded. 12 sailors and 4 airmen were laid out on olive drab stretchers. Most were suffering from second-degree flash burns or lacerations caused by flying glass. When the first shockwave shattered the administration buildings, a young petty officer from the 748th Aircraft Maintenance Squadron lay with his eyes closed, his face covered in soot, as a flight surgeon dressed a deep wound in his shoulder. There was no panic, only the low, urgent murmur of medical reports and the rhythmic hiss of oxygen concentrators. Out on the runway, the FOD walk had already begun. 50 airmen, spaced exactly 2 meters apart, moved slowly down the concrete in a long line. They were looking for foreign object debris, tiny fragments of metal, stone, or glass, that could be sucked into a jet engine and cause a catastrophic failure. Even a single bolt from a destroyed hangar could down an F-35 Lightning fighter during takeoff. The airmen used powerful flashlights to sweep the ground, their breath hitching in the cold air as they worked within 500 meters of the still-burning fuel farm. "We have to get the second flight off the deck," the deputy commander of the 480th Fighter Squadron shouted over the roar of a nearby generator. "The radar is showing more high-altitude tracks forming over the Norwegian Sea. If we don't have interceptors in the air in 20 minutes, we are wide open." The ground crews of the maintenance squadron were working on the 3 remaining F-35 Alpha fighters that had been inside the shelters during the strike. They were hosing down the airframes to remove the corrosive soot and checking the sensitive radar-absorbent coating for heat damage. Every minute counted. The base was wounded. Its primary fuel source was a blackened ruin, and its power grid was hanging by a thread, but the operational mission remained unchanged. By 4:10 in the morning, the primary runway was declared clear. The fire teams had contained the blaze to the northern tanks, preventing the fire from reaching the main ammunition holding area. The cost of the first 30 minutes of the war was being tallied in liters of foam and bags of saline, but the United States military presence in Iceland was far from broken. The sound of the first engine startup for the morning's second sortie began to whine, a high-pitched scream that cut through the sound of the firefighting effort. The base was fighting back, turning its focus from the fires on the ground to the cold, dark sky where the next threat was already gathering. 4:15 in the morning, 200 miles south of the Icelandic coast, the USS Gerald R was cutting through the heavy North Atlantic swells. At 30 knots, its 4 massive bronze propellers pushing over 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered steel toward the fight. Carrier Strike Group 12 had been operating under strict emission control for 72 hours, but as the first reports of the missile impact at Naval Air Station Keflavik reached the fleet, the silence was broken. The carrier was no longer a ghost in the fog. It was a mobile airfield and the center of a massive electronic umbrella that was now unfolding over the North Atlantic. The flight deck was a theater of controlled violence. The air was a freezing mist of salt spray and the screaming roar of dual-engine turbofans. The deck crews, wearing color-coded jerseys that were now wet with the freezing Atlantic rain, moved in a practice dance around the FA-18 Super Hornets and the F-35 Bravo fighters. The smell of high-grade jet fuel and the metallic heat of the electromagnetic aircraft launch system hung heavy over the bow. Launch, launch, launch. The air boss called from the primary flight control tower. With a sound like a crack of thunder, an E-2 Delta Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft was hurled off the deck. The massive rotodome on its back began to spin, its AN/APY-9 radar instantly piercing through the clouds. Within seconds, the aircraft had established a data link with the surviving ground sensors at Keflavik, and the destroyer DDG-131, the USS John Basilone. The fragmented picture of the North Atlantic airspace was suddenly fused into a single, high-resolution tactical map. The E-2 Delta was followed immediately by a flight of 4 EA-18 Golf Growlers from the 129th Electronic Attack Squadron. These were the electronic ghosts of the fleet. As they climbed to 12,000 meters, their specialized jamming pods began to flood the Russian radar frequencies with a wall of white noise. The Russian Su-57 felons that had been loitering near the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap suddenly found their screens filled with false targets and electronic clutter. The tactical advantage of the Russian stealth fighters was being systematically dismantled by the superior power of American electronic warfare. Accompanying the carrier were the shields of the strike group, the cruiser CG-73, the USS Port Royal, and 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. These ships were spaced 5 kilometers apart, creating a layered defensive perimeter. Their Mark 41 vertical launch systems were hot, their SPY-6 radar arrays scanning for the signature of a second wave of cruise missiles. Strike Group 12 to Keflavik Command. The Admiral's voice transmitted over a secure, satellite-encrypted channel. We are on station. We are assuming tactical control of the air defense sector. We have 48 fighters in the air or ready for launch. The gap is closed. The arrival of the USS Gerald R changed the geometry of the battle. The Russian bombers, which had been preparing for a follow-up strike from the north, now faced a fresh, fully fueled wing of American carrier-based fighters. The F-35 Alpha pilots from the ground base, who were exhausted and low on fuel, began to receive mid-air refueling from the carrier's tankers. The North Atlantic was no longer a dark, empty ocean where the Russian long-range aviation could strike at will. It was now a fortress. The sensors of the strike group reached out 500 kilometers in every direction, creating a zone of denial that the Russian forces could not ignore. The air was thick with the signals of Link 16 data transmissions, as every ship and aircraft in the group shared information in real time. On the bridge of the USS Gerald R. the officers watched the glowing blue icons of their fleet moving north. The fire at Keflavik was still visible on the horizon, a tiny orange spark against the black of the night. But the carrier group was moving to ensure that no more fire would fall. The reinforcement was complete, and the tactical initiative was shifting. The hunters from the Kola Peninsula were about to become the hunted. 4:30 in the morning. The North Atlantic, 300 kilometers northeast of Naval Air Station Keflavik. The cruiser CG-73, the USS Port Royal, was already tracking the remnants of the Russian strike force on its AN/SPY-1 Delta radar. The ship was steaming at 28 knots, its bow slicing through the dark, icy water and sending plumes of white spray across the forward deck. In the Combat Information Center, the air was cool and filled with the low, rhythmic hum of cooling fans for the Aegis combat system. The tactical picture provided by the E-2 Delta Hawkeye overhead showed the Russian Tu-95 Bear bombers attempting to reform their cells for the long flight back to the Kola Peninsula. Bridge combat. We have a clear trend on the high-altitude escorts, the weapons officer reported, his voice steady. Range is 240 kilometers. Recommend engagement with Standard Missile 6 to clear the corridor. The Standard Missile 6, or SM-6, was the most versatile weapon in the United States Navy arsenal, capable of intercepting both aircraft and cruise missiles at extreme ranges. Unlike older interceptors, the SM-6 could receive mid-course updates from the E-2 Delta Hawkeye, allowing the cruiser to fire at targets well beyond its own radar horizon. At exactly 4:32 in the morning, the USS Port Royal initiated the counter-interdiction. From the Mark 41 vertical launch system on the forward deck, 16 missiles erupted in rapid succession. The sound was a series of thunderous, chest-compressing booms that vibrated through the hull of the ship. Each missile left the cell in a pillar of white-hot flame, the solid rocket boosters illuminating the dark sea for miles. The missiles accelerated to Mach 3.5 in seconds, climbing to an altitude of 24,000 meters, where the air was thin and friction was low. High above the clouds, the EA-18 Golf Growlers from the USS Gerald R. continued their electronic assault. They focused their high-gain jamming pods on the Russian Su-57 Felon fighters, blinding their radar and severing their data links. The Russian pilots suddenly found themselves flying into a digital void, unable to see the 16 American missiles screaming toward them from the south. The engagement was clinical. The SM-6 missiles used their active radar seekers to find the Russian fighters in the darkness. 5 more Russian aircraft were destroyed in the next 3 minutes, their airframes coming apart under the impact of the blast fragmentation warheads. The remaining Russian escorts, realizing they were being targeted by a force they could neither see nor jam, broke formation and dove for the deck, pushing their engines to the limit to escape the kill zone. The northern corridor is clear. The Admiral reported from the flag bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford. All remaining hostile tracks are retreating toward the east at maximum speed. They are no longer a threat to the base. The counter-interdiction had worked. By using the combined power of the carrier strike group's sensors and the Décommandé long-range reach of the cruiser's missiles, the United States military had pushed the perimeter of the defense hundreds of kilometers away from Iceland. The air above the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap was once again under American control. The Russian attempt to isolate the base had failed, and the hunters were now forced into a desperate retreat across the frozen Barents Sea. 5 in the morning. Naval Air Station Keflavik. The first pale, bruised light of a northern dawn began to bleed across the Icelandic horizon, revealing the true scale of the devastation left by the Russian cruise missile strike. The violent orange inferno that had dominated the night was now a low, smoldering carpet of black soot and thick, white chemical foam. The air was heavy, tasting of scorched metal and the cloying, sweet smell of vaporized fire-suppressant chemicals that clung to the flight suits of the recovery teams. Under the cold morning light, the 72nd Air Base Wing Damage Assessment teams moved across the tarmac like ghosts in silver reflective suits. Their primary objective was to tally the cost of the defense and determine the immediate operational status of the base. The report they compiled in the following hour was a grim testament to the precision of the KH-101 cruise missiles and the high price of maintaining the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap. The human cost was the first and most painful entry in the log. 16 personnel from the United States Navy and the United States Air Force were confirmed killed in action. Most had been caught in the initial blast at the fuel farm or inside the maintenance hangar when the third missile struck. Another 42 personnel were listed as wounded, with 12 in critical condition being prepared for medical evacuation to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, via a C-17 Globemaster transport aircraft that was already taxiing onto the cleared runway. The loss of equipment was equally severe. The northern fuel farm, the lifeblood of long-range air operations in the Atlantic, was 70% destroyed. 3 of the 5 massive storage tanks were blackened, crumpled husks of steel. Their contents either burned away or spilled into the containment trenches. Inside the ruins of Hangar 3, 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were reduced to tangled skeletons of charred aluminum and melted rotor blades. The specialized diagnostic bays for the F-35 Lightning fighters had also been neutralized, forcing the ground crews to rely on portable, less capable field kits. However, the report also highlighted the extraordinary professionalism and bravery of the base personnel. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne of the 72nd Civil Engineer Squadron was cited for leading a team into the burning power substation while the strike was still underway. Under the threat of secondary explosions, Thorne and his team manually bypassed the severed high-voltage lines, restoring emergency power to the AN/SPY-6 radar and the command bunker within 4 minutes of the impact. Their actions ensured that the United States Navy never lost sight of the incoming second wave, allowing the USS John Basilone to intercept the remaining threats. "The base is wounded, but it is breathing," the commanding officer reported during the 5:30 morning briefing. "Our primary runway is 100% operational. Our radar is hot. Our hangars are still launching aircraft. The enemy intended to turn Keflavik into a graveyard. Instead, they have turned it into a fortress that knows exactly what it is fighting for." The resilience of the base was visible on the flight line. Despite the smoke still drifting across the concrete, a fresh flight of 4 F-35 Alpha fighters was being fueled from the secondary, underground reserves. The airmen working the fuel lines were covered in soot, their eyes red from the smoke, but their movements were fast and precise. They were not just repairing a base, they were preparing for the next phase of a campaign that had only just begun. The tactical summary was clear. The Russian long-range aviation strike had achieved a localized tactical success by destroying the fuel reserves, but it had failed in its strategic objective. Naval Air Station Keflavik remained a functional, lethal node in the North Atlantic defense network. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of jet engines once again drowned out the wind, a defiant roar that echoed across the volcanic plains. The cost of the defense had been high, but the line held by the United States military remained unbroken. 6 in the morning. Naval Air Station Keflavik. Casting a cold, brilliant light across the North Atlantic. The black smoke from the fuel farm had thinned to a gray haze, drifting lazily toward the southwest over the churning whitecaps of the ocean. From the edge of the primary runway, the silhouette of the USS Gerald R was visible on the horizon, a massive, gray island of steel that served as a reminder that the isolation of Iceland was an impossibility. The final tactical report was transmitted to United States European Command at exactly 6:15 in the morning, on the 24th of March, 2026. The document, classified as a post-engagement summary, provided a clinical analysis of why the Russian saturation strike had failed to achieve its strategic goal. Of the 48 KH-101 cruise missiles launched by the Tu-95 Bear bombers, 36 had been intercepted by the layered defenses of the United States Air Force and the United States Navy. The integrated fire control network, linking the F-35 Alpha fighters, the AN/SPY-6 radar at Keflavik, and the Aegis combat system on the USS John Basilone, had functioned with a 92% efficiency rate during the initial engagement. The 7 missiles that bypassed the shield caused significant infrastructure damage, but they failed to crater the runway or destroy the primary command and control bunkers. The Russian Federation had spent millions of dollars in advanced munitions to achieve a temporary logistics delay, but the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap remained firmly under American control. The adversary underestimated the speed of our data link integration, the base commander noted in the final summary. By the time their second wave reached the coast, they were no longer fighting a static ground base. They were fighting a distributed, mobile network that included a carrier strike group and long-range interceptors. We didn't just hold the line, we moved the line 500 kilometers to the east. The air above the base was now filled with the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of a Pate Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. It was banking north, its sensors scanning the deep water for any sign of the Russian submarines that usually followed a long-range aviation strike. Below it, the F-35 Alpha fighters of the 480th Fighter Squadron continued their combat air patrol, their gray wings gleaming in the morning light. Logistics vessels were already being diverted from Naval Station Norfolk and Naval Station Rhoda to begin the immediate resupply of jet fuel. Engineers from the Air Force Civil Engineer Center were scheduled to arrive within 12 hours to begin the permanent reconstruction of the fuel farm and the maintenance hangars. The resilience of the base was not just measured in its ability to take a hit, but in the speed and professional discipline of its recovery. The North Atlantic remained a cold and unforgiving theater of operations. The smell of salt spray and frozen basalt had returned to the air, slowly washing away the acrid scent of the night's fire. The United States military presence in the Arctic had been tested by a peer-level threat and had emerged with its operational capacity intact. The unbroken line was not just a phrase, it was a physical reality etched into the radar screens and the determined faces of the sailors and airmen, standing watch. At 6:45 in the morning, the base commander stepped out of the hardened bunker and looked toward the runway. A flight of two F-35 Alpha fighters was taking off, their engines roaring with a power that shook the very ground he stood upon. They climbed toward the north, disappearing into the pale blue sky to relieve the pilots who had fought through the night. The battle was over, the defense was successful, and the watch continued.